All right, you guys, this is week 5 of quarantine time, and this is the first set of information that is new that you're actually going to need to know and that we'll be quizzing you on Friday. All right. Now, all of the stuff in this slideshow is also covered in the reading, which is pages 431 to 455. So if you want to do one, if you want to do the other, if you want to just watch this to reinforce your reading, it is totally up to you. Remember, you can take notes, you can not take notes, you can use all of that on your quiz on Friday. All right. So a couple things about this PowerPoint. I am going to give you guys different scenarios and you will just think on your own which option would you choose. The most important thing about this is don't take notes on the scenarios or on the options. That will make this be a lot longer, so don't worry about those. That is just for your information, just to get you thinking. There will be several of those throughout the PowerPoint. Now, this is a very long PowerPoint with a lot of different information because it's talking about the early Cold War throughout the world. Next week, we'll look at the Cold War just in the United States, the Red Scare, fear of communism, McCarthyism, and that kind of thing. That will be a lot more specific to the United States. This is going to be general overview stuff, okay? So I'm not going to get super detailed about any one thing, just a general overview of what was going on in the world during this time, okay? If you want to find out more about certain things, feel free to look it up. Things such as the Berlin airlift, you'll be watching a video on Tuesday. The Korean War, you saw that on your Music Monday. So just a general overview again. Okay, ready to get started? Here we go. Challenge number 1. World War II ended with a massively destructive new weapon, the atomic bomb, in 1946. The United States is the only nation with this nuclear technology. Several other countries are working on it, but what should we do? Are we going to allow everyone to use it? Are we going to allow everyone to keep working on it? What do you think? So here are your options. Again, don't take notes on these. This is just to get you thinking. So option 1, let everyone develop nuclear weapons. We can't control that. Option 2, suggest a ban saying that we get to keep all of ours, but no more in the future. Option 3, we get rid of our nuclear weapons. No one else gets any more. No new nuclear weapons going forward. Option 4, let's just bomb anyone that is creating nuclear weapons, right? Then only we will have them. So, which option would you choose, and which option do you think the United States chose? Now, here comes the part you actually need to take notes on. What did the US choose? Option 2, we should get to keep our weapons, but no one else gets to make any weapons, and we won't make any more in the future. Now, how do you think other countries felt about that? Especially the Soviet Union, who's really close to developing a nuclear weapon and is our biggest competition at the moment. So, where does this idea come from? How do we come up with this option 2? First off, see that guy right there? That is Mr. Kennan. He was working as a US diplomat in the Soviet Union when he writes the Long Telegram in 1946. The Long Telegram is sent to our president and our government from Kennan saying the Soviets are working on nuclear weapons. They know what's going on. They are really close. We need to put this in check ASAP. Which is when the US reaches out to the United Nations and the United Nations creates the Atomic Energy Commission. That commission has to come up with a plan for what it should tell the world about nuclear weapons. The US proposes the Baruch Plan in 1946 to the UN. That is option number 2. The Baruch Plan says the US gets to keep their weapons, but we will stop research and making any more weapons, and no one else is allowed to make weapons or research weapons. Now, the Soviets, obviously, feel like this is a really bad deal. It's not fair. And that will lead to an arms race between these two nations. An arms race is a building up of arms. It's a race. We have an atomic weapon. They want one too. Once they get one, we have to have a bigger bomb. Then they have to have a bigger bomb. Then we have to have more bombs. Then they have to have more bombs. And we just keep building up. All right? The Soviets will try or test out their first atomic bomb successfully in 1949. And at that point, we are even. And that's when the arm race really escalates. So that brings us to challenge number 2. All right, so we are in an arms race with the Soviet Union, but what is that going to look like? And here comes our first test, okay? So the Iron Curtain descends. That's that yellow line that separates democratic Western Europe from Soviet-controlled communist Eastern Europe. Now, Greece, if you can see them down at the very bottom there, I know I'm kind of blocking it, is kind of on the border. And Greece is embroiled in a civil war. Communist rebels on one side, democratic government on the other side. Now, do we allow Greece to fall to the communists? Are we going to allow democratic nations to be taken over by communist rebels? This is kind of a first test because this could happen all over Europe and all over the world. So what do we do? Here are your options. Remember, don't take notes on these. Option 1, do nothing. It's not our place, right? Soviets aren't directly involved either. We shouldn't step in. Option 2, let's give money to the Greek government to fight off the rebels. Just money, financial aid. Option 3, let's actually send troops to help defeat the communists. And then we'll train the Greeks to defend themselves as well. Option 4, let's just take over Greece, right? Then we can directly fight the Soviets from there. Now, what would you do? And what do you think the US actually did? All right, take a second, think about it, read through them. And what does the US actually do? Option number 2. Now, here are some key vocab words in bold. I know this is a lot on this slide, so we'll go through it piece by piece, okay? Now, the Soviet Union has not directly taken over any nations, but they have set up satellite states in Poland and other Eastern European countries, and that's what they want to do in Greece as well. That means that they are indirectly controlling what is going on in that country, and that those countries are communist nations acting as a buffer with Western Europe. What that means, a buffer nation is, it's almost like this, like a moat around the Soviet Union so that Germany or other nations won't be able to invade them. They'd have to go through these countries first, okay? And that is where we get the Iron Curtain, that term coined by Winston Churchill. Remember him? The Iron Curtain is that it'll actually become real in several areas, but it is a line that separates communist East Europe from democratic Western Europe, all right? So when the Greek Civil War happens in 1946, what does Truman do? He creates the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine says, we will financially, not with actual troops, but financially support countries trying to defend their democracy against communism. And that is what we do in Greece. We give them money, we give them military aid, just not actual troops because we do not actually want to fight. And we push back the communist rebels and democracy is maintained. And here comes our last word, actually 2 last words. One will be, this starts our policy of containment. We are not actually going to go and fight communists, but we want to contain communism where it is and stop it from spreading. Last vocab word for this is a proxy war. So a proxy war is a war fought in a third location, okay? So in Greece, it was the Greeks fighting, but the communists were backed by the Soviets and the democratic government was backed by the United States. So it was almost like they were puppets playing out what we and the Soviets wanted. So that is a proxy war, a third party war. And in this one, the first proxy war, democracy wins, all right? So if we look at that map right there, the dark green nations are communist, the light green nations are either independent or democracies. Spain is kind of doing their own thing over there, and so are the North African countries. But you can see where Greece is and kind of maintaining democracy along the Mediterranean, along those big waterways is important. So there's our Iron Curtain, there's Winston Churchill. So you can see in the top picture here, it does actually turn into a physical wall in certain areas, and that's a checkpoint up there at the top. So if we look at this map right here, nothing you need to write down, take a break, shake out your hand, but you can see where we have these Soviet-controlled satellite nations and our democratic nations in green. Yugoslavia in the middle there is a communist nation, but it is not considered a satellite nation because their leader refuses to answer to Moscow. So it is a communist state that is not controlled by the Soviet Union, only. So let's look at another example of proxy war or a Soviet versus US, and this is going to happen in Germany. So you guys are going to watch a video on the Berlin airlift, so I'm not going to give you a ton of extra information on that. We know that France, Great Britain, and the United States each were controlling a piece of Western Germany. They will unite to form one Western Germany with one currency, that'll be the Deutschmark. And this is really going to upset the Soviets in East Germany. Now, if you look at this map, the most important thing to notice here is little tiny Berlin in Eastern Germany, and that little tiny yellow part that is West Berlin that is controlled by the Allied powers, no longer the Allied powers, but by that combined effort of the US, France, and Great Britain. So what happens? West Germany unites, we just talked about that. And in the Soviet-controlled section of East Berlin and East Germany, what the Soviets have done, and you saw this in the video, is they don't ever want Germany to rise up again. So their plan is to take everything of value out of East Germany, including everything in their factories, and just leave the people decimated. They have nothing, they are desperate. So while West Germany is thriving under democracy and all the money they're getting from the United States, East Germany is dying. And people are flooding out of East Germany and flooding out of East Berlin. Now in Berlin specifically, you have this, they call it a brain drain, where intellects, people with any kind of money that remain in East Berlin are just walking across to West Berlin and declaring that they want refuge, and we are accepting them. And the Soviets get so upset with this that they blockade, they actually physically block off the entrance to West Berlin, which means that West Berlin is getting no supplies, no food, no weapons, no basic supplies that they need. And what is the West going to do? You saw in the video, they had three options. They could just give it up and let West Berlin be taken over by the communists. They could bring in troops, but that would start a war. And we have talked about this arms race, and we really don't want a war at this point with the Soviets. So the third option is going to be the Berlin airlift. So for almost a year, the Brits and the US, and you'll see more in the video, flew tons. We're talking 4,000, 4,500 up to 6,000 pounds worth of goods into West Berlin. And they were very, very successful. And we get to the point, Stalin will try and go through winter, because you always think of winter, right, with the Soviets. That's unsuccessful. And so by May of 1949, the Soviets lift the blockade and democracy prevails again, right? So that is another example of Soviet failure in this war there. So that is another example of a proxy war. Now in this one, we don't have actual physical fighting, but it's another example of West Berlin being backed by democracy in the United States, East Berlin being backed by the communists and the Soviets. And what happens at the very end, with about a month left in the blockade, the nations that came together to support West Berlin said, why don't we create an actual organization in case anything like this ever happens again? And that will be the creation of NATO, which is still around today, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You can see, this is a really cool map. Actually, there were 12 original nations. Those are the ones in black. And as nations have joined throughout the years, you can see which nations join in which years. And that is still an organization that is around today. So the Soviets see NATO formed. And of course, they say, well, if they have an alliance, we communist nations also need an alliance. And that alliance will become the Warsaw Pact. Now, you don't need to write down all the nations in here. I just wanted you to see where they were at. These are all going to be the orange nations. There were 8 original members. As communism and the Soviet Union crumbles, nations will begin to step away from the Warsaw Pact. Now, NATO nations were able to financially and militarily help each other. The Warsaw Pact will try to do that, but the Soviets are broke after World War II. They really can't give money to these nations. So it's not going to be quite as powerful as NATO, but it will still be an alliance among communist nations. So that brings us back to our original NATO pact and Warsaw Pact here, what it looks like in 1955, and there's Yugoslavia not belonging to the Warsaw Pact, communist, but not backed up by Moscow. So let's turn our attention to Asia and what is happening over there, the Cold War and communism spreading. So in China, again, you guys are going to watch a video on this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. In China, after World War II, we will have this was kind of brewing pre-World War II. It'll pause, they all unite to fight in World War II, and then it will come back up afterwards. We've got the communists led by Mao, there he is, against the nationalists. In October of 1949, the nationalists will finally flee, and communism will take over, establishing the People's Republic of China, which is still technically around today. The Chinese nationalists, and this is what most impacts the United States, is the Chinese nationalists will flee to the island of Taiwan. We will actually recognize Taiwan as the capital of China, or as the leader of China, for quite a long time. We push for the UN not to accept communist China into the United Nations, but instead to accept Taiwan. And there is drama even today about what is going on in Taiwan. This is a never-ending battle. Now, here we go. After the fall of China to communism, the US won't recognize the People's Republic. They block their entrance into the UN. And so what are we going to do? Like, nations are falling like dominoes, right, to communism. So we decide, just like we did in Europe, that we need to build up democratic nations in Asia, and we will start with Japan. MacArthur is sent to Japan to rebuild, and as we know, Japan will become an economic powerhouse, thanks to the financial backing of the United States. Think of it. Japan will not have a military for a very long time. They will have US occupation. If you didn't have to pay for military and you're getting financial backing, you are going to go gangbusters, and that's what Japan does. So that brings us to our second big proxy war, and kind of our first true war that the US will be involved in. And actually, you can't even call this a proxy war because the United States is directly involved. So let's look at Korea. You can see it down on the map there. Korea, constantly occupied, originally occupied by Japan, leading up to World War II. But after World War II, Japan is disarmed, right? So the United States and the Soviets go into Korea. And directly after World War II, they will divide Korea at the 38th parallel. You can see the line right there where those red marks are on the map. The North will be backed by the Soviet Union and will be communist. The South will be backed by the United States, and they will be democratic. The goal is that eventually all of Korea will reunite and have one combined election. But on June 25th, 1950, North Korea will invade South Korea in an effort to unite the peninsula under communism. This is obviously backed by the Soviet Union. But if you look at the map there, you can see it's actually China that is closest, and China has just had a communist revolution as well, so they are also communist. So the United States cannot allow this to happen, but they also directly don't want to get involved in this war. So they go to the United Nations. Ooh, some of this is blocked off. That's okay, we'll figure it out. So Truman, President of the United States at the time, calls for a meeting of the United Nations, and the United Nations says, this is what we are built for. They agree to a police action. They are going to send in a coalition of 17 nations to push North Korea back and maintain that border at the 38th parallel. Now, 17 nations are technically involved, but over 90% of the troops the United Nations sends in are actually United States soldiers. So Douglas MacArthur, remember him, he keeps popping up. He was in Japan, he was in World War I, World War II, in the Pacific, in the Philippines. He is put in command of regaining South Korea for democracy. So US troops have been pushed back. If you can see, I know this map is really small, but North Korean troops have pushed all the way through Seoul, all the way to Busan. See that all the way at the bottom? They have almost completely taken over the peninsula. So MacArthur is going to do a daring amphibian raid at Busan. They will come in. They are going to, under MacArthur, the UN troops are going to push the North Korean troops all the way back. They get to the 38th parallel, but it's MacArthur. He's not going to stop there, so he continues to push into North Korea all the way up to the Yalu River. See it right there on the border of China? Once he gets close to the Yalu River, China goes, heck no, this is not okay. China sends in troops. Chinese troops combined with North Korean troops push MacArthur all the way back, and we end up back at the at the 38th parallel. So we basically end up right back where we started. Now, MacArthur wants to expand the war. He says, we can win this. We can take over all of Korea. Now, think to yourself, is that what we want right now? How are we going to do this? How are we going to expand the war? MacArthur wants to use atomic weapons. Is that a good idea? Think of our arms race. Think of what would happen. So, what does Truman, President of the United States at the time, do in order to calm this down? He fires MacArthur. Truman does not want an expanded war. He wants a limited war. He wants things to go back the way they were. So we want to contain communism, not to take our fight to communists. So he fires he fires MacArthur, and let's get to right here. Peace talks will begin in November of 1951. We are going to have an armistice, which is, remember, an armistice has happened in World War I as well. An armistice is just a pause in the fighting to negotiate peace. So we'll have an armistice in July of 1953, but a peace agreement is never actually signed. Technically, Korea is still at war, North Korea and South Korea. They never signed a peace agreement. We just have the armistice even up to today, and it will remain divided at the 38th parallel right there. So who wins? Really no one, right? Communism is contained, so the US policy of containment works, but a lot of fighting happened, and that war is often called the Forgotten War because the US didn't win, and we don't like to talk about wars that we don't win. So here comes our next challenge. And again, don't write this down. We're just moving on to our next challenge. So World War II left Europe devastated. They have not grown any food. They have nothing to eat. They have no money. Their economies are devastated. Their factories have been blown up. Their houses have been blown up. Men, women, children are all left homeless, starving, with many of their family members dead. So, are they going to fall to the idea of communism? If you are starving and poor and you don't have a job, communism actually sounds pretty good. So how is the United States going to battle that? And here are our options. Again, I'm sorry, I know my picture is blocking this. So option one, do nothing. We spend a lot of money in Europe helping them win the war. Let them figure it out. Two, do we do loans that they will have to pay back on a case-by-case basis to our allies? Three, are we going to give a ton of money to anyone that needs it as long as they promise to spend that money on US goods and US products and to stay democratic? It's possible. Option four is going to send military options or send military troops and advisors to begin the post-war buildup. Is that what we should do? What do you think? 1, 2, 3, or 4? Now, I'm giving you a second. Think about it. What does the US actually do? That is going to be the Marshall Plan, which is option 3. So the Marshall Plan is going to give funding, it doesn't have to be paid back, to rebuild as long as that money is spent on US goods. So this is kind of a win-win, right? The US economy after World War II, we are making a lot of stuff and now we don't really have as many people to sell it to. So this gives us a market, right? It also helps us rebuild these economies so that they will stay democracies and not fall to communism. If you look at that number right there, that's the number you need to know. Between 1948 and 1952, we will give, not expecting anything back, $13 billion to democratic nations in Europe. Now, just like with the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union goes, yeah, you're just creating satellite nations for the United States. We need to do the same thing. So in 1949, they create the Molotov Plan, named after the man who came up with the idea, where they will offer aid to Eastern European countries to stay communist. Now, they do not have anywhere near the money or really even much money to give, so this is more just an extension of the Warsaw Pact. Now, we have looked at the Cold War in Asia. We have looked at the Cold War in China specifically and Korea. We've looked at the Cold War in Europe. So communism is starting to spread throughout the world. And now we are going to look at third world nations, which is a really derogatory term, but nations that are just developing as new nations, that are kind of having to decide if they are going to, what type of government they're going to have. Are they going to have democracies? Are they going to have communist nations, communist leadership? So how are we going to fight communism in other locations, right? Specifically in Latin America. So we are going to have four main strategies. We are going to use propaganda. We are going to use money. We are going to use covert actions, and we are going to use MAD, which is mutually assured destruction. And that's kind of more strategy just against the Soviet Union. So again, this is all in your book. All of these bold words are the bold words in your book. So let's look at some examples. And I know I am moving really quickly, but feel free to pause this whenever you want and pick up another day, or just to listen to me and use this as reinforcement for your book notes, okay? So let's look at propaganda first. So you can't see all of this, but that is nations that are democratic. That's the United States falling to communism. Pretty scary, right? See that guy in the back there being choked out by a communist, right? This is an example of propaganda. So we are fighting covert war, propaganda war against the Soviet Union for third world nations. And that will start in 1953 with the creation of the U.S. Information Agency. Now, their entire job is to spread, we'll say exaggerated, possibly false information about communism to nations that are kind of on the fence about where they're going to go with their governments. Specifically, this is going to start with radio broadcasts that are being sent to the Eastern Bloc, to those communist nations controlled by the Soviet Union, talking about freedom, talking about the Greek Civil War and how democracy prevails. And it really gives a lot of nations in the Eastern Bloc hope that the United States will back them up. There are going to be several examples of uprisings in these nations, in Poland and Hungary. Hungary specifically, that's in the book. We don't really talk about it here, but where they will rise up thinking the United States will come to their aid, and we really don't. Because remember, we do not want an actual war with the Soviet Union. We're willing to give money, to give aid, but we will not send troops because we do not want that battle. So especially in Hungary, there will be an uprising. They expect the United States to come, and we don't. So let's look at an example of giving money. This is almost, you can see almost all of this, supporting government troops. All right, so a great example that I don't believe is in your book about us, as in the US and democracy, supporting nations in their struggle between what type of government they're going to have is going to be in Egypt. Now, we will do this in Turkey, we'll do this in Pakistan, South Korea, we've already talked about. So in Egypt in 1956, at this point, if you look at that picture, that's the leader on our left of Egypt. On the right is Nikita Khrushchev. Stalin dies in 1953. Khrushchev will take over. He will denounce many of Stalin's policies, but he will maintain the Cold War and kind of flip-flop all over the place. Like one minute we think he's going to kind of start to be friendly with us. The next minute he kind of goes crazy, like he will do here. So in Egypt, we were funding the Aswan Dam. in order to maintain a friendly relationship with their government. They will start buying Soviet products, Soviet weapons. We say, don't do that, or we're going to stop funding this dam. And they don't stop, so we stop. We stop funding them. That will lead to the Suez Canal crisis, Suez, S-U-E-Z, in which Egyptian rebels will take over control of the British-controlled Suez Canal. Now, if you go all the way back into world history, you know the Suez Canal is a major connecting waterway between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. So that's going to be a really big deal. Once we stopped funding them, the Egyptians convert fully over to a Soviet ally, and this is going to be one of the prime examples of a U.S. loss in the Cold War. So that is through aid. No military involvement, but that is an example of money and support. So if we look right here on this map, you can see where the Suez Canal is, why that's such a major connector between those two important waterways. So third, so we had propaganda, we had financial support, and that brings us to covert action. And this is in bold because it's the definition from the book. Covert action is secret political, economic, or military action that supports a foreign policy. So if they wouldn't accept our money and they didn't like our propaganda, we would bring in covert, usually military groups, or we would secretly fund anti-communist groups or right-leaning groups. This is where we tended to get in a lot of trouble, or post-Cold War got in a lot of trouble. I'm not going to go into great detail about any of these, but I'm going to give you a couple brief examples, and then you can look more into them if you would like to. So example number one, again, that's blocked. I apologize for that. In Iran. So these are going to be all over the world. A lot of these will happen in Latin America, but we have several Middle Eastern examples as well. Remember that Middle East is a key spot because of waterways and because of oil, right? They have resources that we need, and the Soviets want them as well. So in 1953, there is a coup in Iran. Now remember, this is right around the time of Stalin's death, so the Soviets are having a lot of upheaval as well. And in that coup, so in Iran, we have a prime minister, Mossadegh, that's him right there, who is anti-British, anti-United States, and is unwilling to cooperate with us. And so we will go in and support an overthrow of Mossadegh and bring back the Shah. Now, the Shah and his family had been in charge in Iran for quite a long time. They were known for being very oppressive to the people, for not being good advocates or even good leaders, but they were friendly to the United States. So this is one of the examples that is used about the U.S. Being so worried about communism that we are not looking out for the best interests of the country itself. So the Shah comes back into power. He goes right back to his oppressive ways, but he's friendly with the United States and helps us with the resources that we need. So this is kind of a mixed bag example where we get the outcome that we want, but it might not have been the best for the people of Iran. So another example, a little closer to home, Guatemala, 1954. The man speaking right there is Guzman. He is not so much communist, but he is definitely left-leaning. He will start to nationalize or take over. This is kind of what happened in Venezuela several years ago. Foreign-owned businesses. He will start to work for reforms. The United Fruit Company, which is a U.S. owned, I mean, this is a multinational company at this point, has a lot of plantations and work areas set up in Guatemala where they pay very, very low wages to workers, to Guatemalans, And Guzman starts to put into place reforms for better working conditions, better living conditions, higher wages. The United Fruit Company is angry about this and asks the United States to intervene. And we do. The CIA will covertly come in and help to overthrow Guzman and his government and put into place basically a dictatorship that is, again, friendly to the United States and the United Fruit Company. So another example of an outcome that we were happy with, but maybe not the best for the people of Guatemala. And I think that brings us to our last example. Now we're into the Caribbean, so similar area of the world, 1962, so a little bit later. And you can see up there in Time magazine, this is going to be the guy. So President Bosch is elected. There will be a civil war between the general up there on Time magazine and Bosch and his leftist leaning rebels. Now Bosch was elected, but there is kind of this civil war going on between a leftist elected official and the military backed by the United States. The United States, I mean, these locations are getting closer and closer to us, and we are fearful that another Cuba will happen, communist Cuba, backed by the Soviet Union. And so we come in and brutally help the military regain control of the Dominican Republic. So again, outcome we wanted. Was it best for the people? That is still up for debate. So you can see covert action, especially in Latin America, going all the way into the 80s, is really going to make the United States not look really good throughout the world, but it is going to put into power people that support the United States and not always the nicest to their own people. So on to our last little piece here, and this is going to be the arms race that we did talk about early in the very beginning of this PowerPoint. So in 1949, the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb, which arms race means we need to continue racing against the others. So once they have that, we need to up our game. And that is when we create the hydrogen bomb, which is a smaller but even more powerful bomb. The US will successfully test one in 1952, but the Soviets will also have one by 1953. So we are getting closer and closer and more powerful. Something else that we begin to develop and to race to get more and more of are ICBMs, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles, which can deliver these nuclear warheads long distances. These will also begin to be used on submarines. So that race will happen as well. And this brings us to our last piece, which is the idea, this will come around in the 50s with Eisenhower, of brinkmanship, going to the brink or to the edge of war. We'll see this in Taiwan against China, backed by the Soviet Union, where Mao and the Chinese try to reclaim Taiwan as part of mainland China. The U.S. threatens a nuclear attack, going to the brink of that war. Like we're gonna push the button, push the red button, and China backs off, showing that brinkmanship can work, going to the edge but not totally declaring war. And why do we do that? Because everyone has a fear of MAD, which becomes a really big thing during this time, which is mutually assured destruction. That if we push the button to send a bomb to the Soviet Union, by the time it gets there, they'll have already pushed the button and everyone will be destroyed. So that was a big reason to push this way. Okay, now I know this was long. I hope that this just reinforced the notes that you already have, or that you're just listening to this and taking notes on this. Remember to get your reading done, to watch the other videos, and good luck on your quiz on Friday. Hope you guys are doing okay.